Hello, my name is Andrew Amundsen, and I'm going to be talking to you about violent video games. So violent video games have been a topic in society for a long time on if they cause anyone to perform violent actions or more aggression. Violent video games, my main claim though is that violent video games has zero correlation to people's violent actions. I will prove this through 3 points. Violent video games are not proven to cause anyone to perform violent actions. Violent video games only attract more people with violent tendencies rather than causing more aggressive tendencies. And violence has also dropped in society with the introduction of violent video games over the past years. With the rise of violent video games in society today, many young adults have been playing violent video games, and so in theory, more violent actions should be occurring by those who believe this. But on the contrary, the scientific community believes that violent video games have zero correlation to violent actions. With the Sandy Hook shooting, 20-year-old Adam Lazon played violent video games. So the Senator J. Rockefeller believed that it was the violent video games that caused his actions. So he proposed that the Senate create a study to perform if violent video games had any effect on his brain. This study was conducted and concluded that there was no harm on the human brain from violent video games. Another study conducted by Ferguson concluded with 3 theories. He concluded violent video games exposure has a learn-based experience with subsequent aggression, which causes subsequent violent acts to become less imposed on your brain, which means as you play more violent video games, violent acts become less and less prominent in your brain. Individuals with higher levels of aggression are drawn to violent video games with higher levels of aggression. And the correlation between violent video games and violent actions is caused by a third underlying factor, not the video games itself. For Ferguson's experiment, he split up 100 children, ages 12 to 18, into 2 groups. The 2 groups were one group of children that lived in more impoverished areas with higher crime rates, maybe abusive households or violent households, and they were being bullied. And the second group was children, young adults living in households of more caring families, less crime rate, or just better living conditions. This was a 12-month period that he checked on the children to see what actions had occurred from them playing violent video games over this time period. At the end of the 12 months, he concluded that nonviolent crimes were equal across both settings. So all the crimes that they committed that were nonviolent, whether that be a little theft here and there, or a lie to someone of authority, were equal across both parties. But there was a 6% increase in violent actions with those who lived in violent homes or crime-ridden areas or were being bullied. That's a 6% increase in violent actions from those who were in a different setting with a third underlying factor of violent households or crimes. Another study was conducted surveying a large amount of teens, seeing is how many of them play video games. It concluded that 90% of teens play video games, and of those video games, 2/3 are violent video games. This concludes that there's a chance that there's a 60% of all teens are playing violent video games. With this study, there has been a finding that there's been a decrease of violent crimes committed in society since the introduction of violent video games from 1996. Since violent video games have been introduced, violent crimes have been on the decrease. Violent video games have become more of an outlet rather than a source of violent actions. And violent video games are not the cause of violent actions occurring from people. For violent video games causing people to become more violent, but rather having higher levels of aggression draws people to playing violent video games. And people are not creating violent actions due to violent video games, but rather a third underlying cause.
All right, Andrew, we know what the topic area is, and your propositional statement gets a little bit complicated because you hesitate about having the word not. You change it halfway through. You clarified it ultimately. It was tough, though, because the secondary claims then proceed to make the same mistake. So that makes it a little bit confusing. In the body of the speech, I didn't think you did a very clear job indicating where you were moving from one point to the next. And in fact, a lot of the data seem to sort of run together, and especially when you're going through that description of the one study with all the details in it, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be applying part of that study to the first point that you're presenting and part of it to the second point that you're talking about. And when the third point comes in, I don't think that most people recognize that you'd actually moved to that third point. You'd need more data on that third point, because it sounds to me like you were talking about what the trends are, the social trends are, but I didn't hear any specific reference to crime rates and that sort of thing. Mostly I heard a reference back to the study that you talked about on the second point. And I think that you can recognize that there are some problems explaining this, because right at the end of the speech, when you're doing the summary, trying to remind us what the point was, I think the audience was still a little unclear as to what the point was. Because it was hard to tell that you had finished at that point. You need to come down to the point that says, look, we don't have any evidence that shows that it has a positive effect. We have evidence that shows that it has a negative relationship to it. The people who are drawn to these video games that are violent are influenced by something other than the violence in the games. It's an underlying factor that causes that. And that if it did have an effect, we would see a social trend that indicated an increase in violence because of the amount of violent video games that are available, and we're simply not seeing that. So the conclusion is that video games really have zero effect on violence in society. I mean, if you said it like that, because that's basically what your argument is, it would be so much clearer. As it was, it just sounded cluttered, and if people are paying close attention, they'll probably figure it out. But we talked about this a little bit. Audiences are notoriously lazy. Not that I'm pointing fingers at any of you folks, but audiences are notoriously lazy. They get easily distracted. Unless they are highly motivated, you have to work them. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do here. And I know sometimes it sounds like you're coming across like you're hitting people over the head with a hammer by being, okay, let's move from point A to point B, let's move from point B to point C, and that leads to A plus B plus C equals this particular conclusion. But the truth is, if you don't do that sort of thing, people will vaguely remember some of the information, but they won't know what they're supposed to have gotten out of it. And I thought that was kind of the problem that was going on in here. Spent a lot of time talking about the one study. You went off on a little tangent on a couple of those points. Some of it's interesting, but not all of it is relevant to the point that you're trying to make. All right, thank you.